Hello, Mark Galliotti here on the 7th of August, and everybody is weighing in on the whole Trump-Putin summit possibilities, so I thought I might as well too. The first point to make is, although I think at this stage it is inevitable that there will be a Putin-Trump summit, probably in the next week, quite where we don't know. There's a lot of suggestions at Riyadh, United Arab Emirates, or maybe even Istanbul. We shall see. But of course, we have no idea actually what's going to go down, not least because, well, with Trump, you never ever really know what you're going to get. Nonetheless, I think there are a few interesting points to make, particularly out of the very limited information we've had from Yuri Ushakov, who is Putin's, he's often described as a presidential aide or presidential advisor. Essentially, he's Putin's foreign policy guy. And in some ways, he has replaced Patrushev as the kind of national security advisor, certainly when it comes to sort of foreign policy issues. And Ushakov is not the sort of chap who just speaks off the cuff. He is in many ways the antithesis of the Trump team. And what he said, and I think we have to take seriously, is that the United States made a proposal which the Russians consider acceptable as the basis for some kind of arrangements. And at first I thought maybe this was just simply a proposal of talks, but it seems to be something more, a ceasefire deal of some kind. Now, this may be the sort of ceasefire deal that had been trailed in the past, which is essentially that the Russians stop. It's not just an air ceasefire, but it's a full ceasefire. The Russians stop where they are. Basically, de facto, it's accepted that what they have stolen from Ukraine, they get to keep, and that the United States, at the least, will lift all or some sanctions, and essentially a big move towards a renormalization, so long as Russia doesn't restart the war. Now, in and of itself, this doesn't address all of Putin's clear desiderata, not least the whole issue of NATO membership. I mean, if he was smart, he'd realise that actually many NATO members don't really want Ukraine in them, if they had to be honest. But that's not the kind of smartness that I expect out of Putin's Kremlin. So we'll see. But to a considerable extent, what Ushakov said, I think we should interpret as the usual kind of pre-summit spinning. Now, the interesting thing is usually what we actually get, certainly in democratic polities, are attempts to depress expectations so that whatever happens then can be trumpeted as, it was even better than we thought. However, there is also sometimes a strategic value in inflating expectations. In other words, in basically saying, the Americans have already suggested that they're in favour of X, Y and Z, because you're trying to lock the Americans into actually having to offer X, Y and Z if they want a positive outcome from the talks. That may well be what's going on now. So again, we should treat it with some caution as part of the pre-summit jockeying for power. Because after all, usually summits happen at the end of a very long process. The Sherpas have made all kinds of pre-deals and such like. This is, as ever in Trump world, something that's much more immediate and ad hoc. And therefore, I think they're having to sort of scramble to shape the grounds rather more crudely. And this is going to be a US-Russian summit. And that's, I think, really important. No Europe, no Ukraine. But ultimately, Trump will be speaking for the United States. He can't actually lock Ukraine or indeed Europe into whatever he agrees, though he might think he does. And again, that's going to be an interesting pressure point. Is he going to basically say, the Europeans are going to follow along, and then the Europeans get the choice of do they actually say, hell no, or do they feel that they are also sort of forced into this? Big imponderable. It's another one of the many reasons why a lot of people did not want there to be a Trump-Putin summit. But here we are. The idea that Trump had floated, which was then subsequently there will be a Trump-Putin-Zelensky meeting, I think that is pretty unlikely. I mean, remember, it's not just that the Russians play this card saying, Zelensky's not the legitimate president of Ukraine because his presidential term has expired, which is, of course, nonsense in the sense that while Ukraine is under martial law, there cannot be new presidential elections. But more to the point, Putin is not going to risk going and meeting Zelensky, being berated and not getting the deal that he wants from it. So he's only going to agree to do this, and I said I think it's not likely, if he feels it's absolutely rock solid, that it's guaranteed that the deal he wants is going to be the one that Zelensky's going to have to accept. And I find it hard to believe that in the current environment Zelensky could or would accept whatever Putin regards as acceptable terms. And therefore, I can't help think that in many ways we're right the way back to spring. And Trump's earlier monumentally generous gift of an offer of a deal to Russia, which, yes, on the part of the United States, not on Ukraine, but nonetheless meant that he would commit to full legal recognition of Russia's annexation of Crimea, de facto acceptance of the other seized territories, full lifting of sanctions, not even partial, but full, in return for essentially Russia stopping the war. So if we're heading back to something that Putin was offered before and didn't accept, if you'd asked me, he should have grabbed it, but clearly he felt there was an even better deal somewhere on the horizon. So in other words, if he thought there was a better deal and now he's being basically offered the same deal, okay, with a little bit more territory bought at monumental cost in human lives, what's changed? And I think this is one of the interesting things, because it does suggest, therefore, that despite all the bullish rhetoric we've heard from Putin and from Moscow generally, that there has been some kind of slight shift in Russian, or rather Putin's, perceptions about the costs of the war, the degree to which he can expect something better, the degree to which he can keep Trump hanging without actually agreeing anything. Now, let's stress, this is not because of the threat of sanctions on Russian exports to the United States, nor is it pressure from India and China because of the threat to sanction them for buying Russian oil. It certainly isn't this claim of 2 American nuclear submarines being repositioned. This is not Putin buckling to Trump's pressure. This is, if it is at all, and usual caveats apply, but if it is the case, it actually represents the degree to which Putin himself is beginning to come to realise the extent to which this war, and certainly this war will continue, if one projects forward for the next year, will actually have massive economic and thus potentially political costs. So maybe, just maybe, all those many technocrats within the system who clearly are not happy with the war have slightly got through to him. We shouldn't count on it as in any way guaranteed. I think it's entirely possible that what we will get is some kind of token thing, a quite possibly temporary ceasefire on long-range air attacks on each other's cities and infrastructure and the like, and nothing more. Just enough for Trump to say, well, hey, I got something out of Putin when no one else does. But on the other hand, also enough to allow him to back away and not feel that he needs to ratchet up the pressure on Russia in order to not look ridiculous. So on the whole, I'm not feeling particularly optimistic. But we have to recognise that if we can take what Ushakov said at face value, and I suspect we can, with all the caveats that he's clearly going to spin and so forth, well, I think it is that the Russians are beginning to wonder if they made a mistake when they turned down Trump's earlier deal. We'll just have to wait and see. Thank you.